Huh. That's pretty nice music there. It's like a fanfare, right? What would it be called? What would be a term, a name for the fanfare? Something with the word common in it, because in fact today we are talking about common sense. It's a phrase that President Trump likes to use a lot, and now his friends over on Fox News are also using common sense with a real frequency that is unprecedented. So why? What's so special about common sense, and why would one person have a monopoly on it over other people? Or is it just something that you say when you want your statement to be unchallengeable? That's what we are going to investigate from many angles on this show.
The following program was previously recorded.
Together, you can't live alone. Considering the weather, oh my, how you've grown. From the men in the factories to the wild kangaroo. Like those birds of a feather, they're gathering together and feeling exactly like you.
So we've been thinking a lot about common sense. It is invoked very regularly now. As we will see, it seems to be invoked especially by the Trump administration, maybe with conscious or unconscious coordination with Fox News. But I just out of curiosity, I decided to see how many podcasts exist that have common sense in the name of the podcast, and there are a lot of them. So this morning I was listening to a show called Common Sense with Dave Hodges. I don't know who he is. But the show is a lot of kind of, Trump talking points, MAGA talking points. But so he comes on and he starts the show. And before he can get into any common sense, he says, but first, and he has to do a little commercial spot. And he says, EMFs, that's electromagnetic fields, can kill you. But not if you buy this patch that you put on your phone that he's selling. And then if you put the patch on your phone, EMFs won't kill you. And that, to me, is kind of this common sense thing in a nutshell. Here's a guy who is nominally trafficking in common sense, and he's saying the thing that really doesn't seem to correspond very well to that. But I'm not the expert in all this. We have experts today. Sophia Rosenfeld is Walter H. Annenberg Professor of History and Chair of the Department of History at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the author of multiple books, including, most relevantly to us, Common Sense, A Political History. Her new book is The Age of Choice, A History of Freedom in Modern Life. Sophia Rosenfeld, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
So let's hear just very quickly. We should say that we are having this conversation on the Wednesday after the not exactly State of the Union address, but what passes for one on this timeline. And we can hear President Trump use a phrase that he likes very much. So let's do A1.
Today I will sign a series of historic executive orders. With these actions, we will begin the complete restoration of America and the revolution of common sense. It's all about common sense.
Actually, that's from the inauguration. So, Sophia, just react generally to this. I mean, one thing about the term common sense is it's almost never a disparaging term. If something is just common sense, that's usually a way of affirming it and suggesting that we stick with it.
Absolutely. Common sense it's an interesting term because in principle, it should be what we all sort of agree on, right? It's the kind of thing that anybody who's lived in the world and has any sort of ordinary experience is going to say, yeah, sure, that's common sense. If I put my hand in the fire, I might get burned, that sort of thing. And so it's a staple of politics for sure. It's the kind of thing you say when you want to say, there's no dispute about this, we can all easily agree. However, most of the time when it gets used, and President Trump is a great example here, it gets used to the exact opposite effect. The more controversial what you're saying is, the more likely you are to say, hey, it's just common sense.
Right. And I find myself thinking of the famous line in 1984, the who controls the past controls the future, who controls the present controls the past. If you can control the idea of what common sense is, you can, I would assume, Sophia, you have a chance of controlling some larger narratives that go along with that.
Yes, so that's part of the point. On the one hand, you might just say, oh, this is just a super polemical way to speak. It's typical Trump to say the opposite of what he means. But common sense gets used not just by Trump, it gets used a lot by politicians on the right and on the left, more often these days on the right. But it's also a way of saying anybody who disagrees with me is sort of spouting nonsense. The opposite of common sense is nonsense. It's not a different opinion. It's something that's just beyond consideration altogether. And in particular, in terms of controlling the narrative, it's a way of saying, I rely on ordinary people's everyday understanding of the world. It's a kind of populist tool, too. And the people who are outside it could be people who are crazy, but it could also be elites with their fancy jargon and their fancy language. It could be anybody who expresses things that aren't really in your own camp. So it works for him both as a kind of trolling tool and as a typical populist form of expression.
Yeah, I want to just pounce on that for a second, too, because I think that's an important part of it. The kind of delegitimization of expertise. That, in fact, if Anthony Fauci, who has decades and decades and decades of experience, says something, it's probably in this particular framing less likely to be true than if Joe Rogan says the opposite thing. Joe Rogan's, it's another very, very influential voice who talks a fair amount about common sense. But it's almost as though within this understanding of common sense, you punish people for knowing a lot about the subject. But react to that.
Yeah, that's quite right, because it does sound consensual. It sounds like no one could be opposed, except if it's being used in this form, it does say somebody's opposed. There's somebody who isn't relying on common sense. And who would that be? Well, most likely that's going to be people who, like Fauci, who have some kind of expertise that, in fact, often does run counter to common sense, like the idea of inoculations themselves. Since you bring up Fauci, you have to accept, which most people who know anything about science do, that you have to, in a sense, be injected with a bit of the poison that's going to keep you safe in the future. But, a common sense perspective, in a sense, could reject that and could say, I'm not putting something alien in my body. And that's the kind of premise, I think, that Trump's operating on, that the people, whether it's economists or doctors or foreign policy experts, who admittedly can sometimes take us very far from common sense. If we listen just to them, we'd be straying from what all ordinary people already know and think. And, he's rescuing us by bringing us back to what real people know and think.
Yeah, and so therefore, as you say, the intuitive trumps the counterintuitive, even if the counterintuitive has a considerably larger amount of proof or kind of empirical proof behind it. So you get Trump in the same environment about the same crisis saying, well, what about bleach? Because we all know bleach kills germs. So wouldn't it make some sense to get some bleach inside you to kill off some of these viruses? And I mean, it seems ludicrous, but it is more intuitive, as you say, than the notion of inoculation.
Right. That's the whole premise here is that, he says, he's actually said on a number of occasions, I don't need to know anything because I have common sense. So I don't need, a medical degree to tell you what to put in your body because, as you say, bleach cleans things out. Why not?
So we're going to show you in just a second, a montage of just how widespread this is, how consistently used it is at the present moment. But we should maybe begin before we do that by talking about the fact that it's kind of in our intellectual DNA as a society. This is, back in 1776, Thomas Paine writes Common Sense. It's a 47-page pamphlet that kind of goes viral, Sophia. There's about 500,000 copies in circulation in the colonies. There aren't that many people in the colonies back in those days. That's pretty impressive. And you have Paine, who is basically taking Lockean ideas. And the idea, it isn't that different from what you're hearing today. Paine himself is kind of, up from very, very humble origins. And what he's saying is Locke's idea that any human has the faculty of apprehending the truth. And, the fact that Thomas Jefferson is better educated than Thomas Paine doesn't necessarily mean that one is more capable of understanding things than the other. And that's Paine's argument for being able to understand why the right of kings doesn't really make sense, why, in fact, the financial abuse of the colonies doesn't make common sense. So it's a pretty powerful part of our kind of bone structure in this country.
That's absolutely the case. I mean, even Trump's invocation, you mentioned the inauguration, you played that little clip, revolution of common sense. Trump's proposing in some ways a very Paine-like idea. Two ways it's similar. One, as you say, he's suggesting ordinary people can get this. You don't have to be any, highfalutin, big brain person to pick up what he's talking about. And the other is this idea that politics itself is susceptible to sort of ordinary ideas. But here's where it's interesting, I think. Paine himself was proposing a lot of things that really were not common sense in his era. He was proposing some radical ideas. He was proposing breaking free of empire and setting up a republic with no king and no aristocracy. Most people were not persuaded that's the way the world just had to be. So in some sense, he was invoking really basic ideas. Paine says, for instance, a little place shouldn't rule a bigger place. Well, I mean, that's true in a certain way, but in fact, that's how long British rule over the empire had lasted for already a few hundred years. So Trump, similarly, is invoking this kind of everyday set of ideas, but he's proposing something kind of radical. And what he's proposing in some ways is a revolution in reverse, a revolution that undoes the assumption that imperialism isn't a good thing, and a revolution that undoes the idea that we shouldn't be ruled by too strong a central authority.
So, yeah, I mean, that little place, big place thing is translated in a very popular recent musical into why should a tiny island across the sea control the price of tea? And so yeah, and I kind of wonder whether there's a through line from that to one of the tropes that one hears invoked a lot these days is I did my own research, which means I didn't count on received wisdom from peer-reviewed papers about whatever it was. I did my own research. That's also a real Joe Rogan kind of phrase. And in a way, it is connecting to Paine's idea of populism, but in a way that feels kind of pernicious at times.
A strange era because, of course, we're bombarded with information all the time, but it comes from lots of different places, and the old mechanisms for vetting it have kind of gone away. So in some ways, as you say, we're in this sort of super democratic age where anyone can research anything, anybody can put up any ideas they want, where sort of information is no longer controlled by much. But the flip side of that is, as you say, everybody thinks they can do their own research, or I follow my truth. We don't have much consensus about what that should be. And there are good parts about ordinary people being skeptical of authority. And we don't want to be a kind of world in which anytime anybody says anything, they're an expert. We just accept it as the truth in some way. But extreme skepticism seems to have set in. And that extreme skepticism says, I can't trust anything. I can't trust government numbers. I can't trust universities. I can't trust if 99% of scientists say that climate is warming, but I went outside and I saw that there was snow in my backyard and I read this other thing online. That's just as good information. Well, that kind of extreme skepticism undermines the ability to run a democracy.
Exactly. Let's just play that montage so that people can hear just how widespread, how pervasive and consistently this is being used. So you are going to hear things from the inauguration and remarks to reporters. And well, anyway, let's just play it and we can talk about it afterwards. Here we go, Dylan.
Over the past 6 weeks, I have signed nearly 100 executive orders and taken more than 400 executive actions, a record to restore common sense, safety, optimism, and wealth all across our wonderful land. Because I have common sense, okay? And unfortunately, a lot of people don't. But in everything we do, we're putting America first because the Republican Party is now known as the party of common sense. It's a party of common sense, very important. I think it's a very important phrase for you to use. It's all about common sense. What the world has witnessed in the past 72 hours is nothing less than a revolution of common sense.
So there you have it. He's not being shy.
Wow.
He's not being shy about using it. It's there all the time. And as you say, Sophia, part of the appeal of that, the idea is that it's not top down. That it's something, we talk a lot these days about the wisdom of the crowd. And we talk about collective sense making. And I think that, as you're suggesting, I think it also arises a lot out of internet culture, that you can get a whole bunch of people together and try to figure out what all of you think is happening about X, but react to all of that.
I think part of it, as you say, certainly comes from our internet culture. That's pretty clear, the sort of anti-expert mode that a lot of people are in these days. Some of it, though, goes back deeper into conservatism, especially the Reagan era. Reagan himself was very fond of invoking common sense. And interestingly, Reagan was very fond of quoting Thomas Paine, who until the 1980s had been much more a kind of hero of the left than a hero of the right. But Reagan picked up that kind of folksy idea that you could just say, all shucks, it's all just kind of common sense. And it was a popular mode, and it worked well. And Republicans have, in a sense, capitalized on that ever since. You find a lot more invocation of common sense typically on the right than on the left in recent decades, though Democrats have tried to with things like common sense gun bills. Sort of more contentious the issue, more likely someone is to call it common sense. I think that's probably fair to say. But Trump has done something. He's gone, as with most things, gone a step farther. He's put together that kind of folksy element of common sense with a sort of demagogic common sense, which is to say a common sense that says if you think anything different from this, you're kind of beyond consideration. It's not a point of view we're even going to entertain.
There's also, I think, a clash between the idea of common sense and idealism. And also a constant clash between common sense and faith. I think in Miracle and on 34th Street, Maureen O'Hara's character tells the little girl, faith is what you believe in when common sense tells you not to. But I think idealism and even ideas like empathy may be characterized as kind of anti-common sense. I think we're seeing that right now, that the idea that people in Africa with HIV we should be getting money to keep new infections from happening, get money over there to control an outbreak of disease in a country that most people are not going to visit. You might have heard Trump last night say that nobody has ever heard of Lesotho. But one of the reasons to do that is empathy, and arguably empathy and common sense, at least common sense the way it's being used right now, are on a collision course, Sophia.
Common sense could support any number of possibilities there, right? You could say common sense could be that we care about children and whether they're going to die anywhere they are in the world. Or you could say common sense could be, well, people move around the planet, so we better prevent disease in other places because they might show up here. Or you could say common sense says, most of us don't even know where that is, so why would we bother to care about it? Those are all possible invocations of common sense. I'm not sure which one really merits the title. But bent towards politics, it doesn't really tell you much on the surface. But you are saying something, I think, important here, which is common sense, yes, is generally the way it's being used right now is often opposed to a kind of idealism. If I had to describe this kind of common sense, I would actually describe it as a weird mashup. A little bit of libertarianism. I just wrote a book about choice, and this stuff is all over Trump's rhetoric too, which is a kind of unregulated commercial sphere, whether you're talking about cars or crypto. But if you combine that with this other idea of a kind of authoritarian government, which is a very strong central authority that has quite an ability to stretch, if not break the parameters of the Constitution in terms of its own powers, and you put together this libertarianism with this authoritarianism, it's not obviously a common sense package at all. In fact, it runs counter to a lot of American traditions. Yet framed this way, it can be suggested that it's kind of like a practical way to deal with things. It's easier to just do things by executive order, that we all already believe in choice. So why not give people choice? And I think the executive orders have said light bulbs, automobiles, and appliances. It's a mashup, but he can call it common sense the way it's described.
I think what you're saying is really important because framing is so incredibly important, and you can frame it the opposite way too, as we've suggested a couple of times here. But I'm going to actually pull something from a kind of famous movie scene here. This is from It's a Wonderful Life. You're going to hear Mr. Potter, who is a jerk and kind of a villain, talking about, I believe, George Bailey's father. Let's hear that.
He was a man of high ideals, so-called. But ideals without common sense can ruin this town.
So, within that framing, Sophia, George Bailey, of course, is the dreamer. He's the idealist. He and his father dream big dreams. They're visionaries compared to Potter. And all Potter wants to do is squeeze every last poor family for the last drop of money that it's got. So here we see Frank Capra framing it the opposite way.
There you've got an opposite political tradition for sure, which is the dream, the vision, the city on the hill. What are we aiming for? But that's a big picture kind of thing. And I don't see Trump ever offering a sort of vision using more traditional political vocabulary in American politics, like a greater equality to come or liberty in the future. That's not his rhetoric. His rhetoric is power, strength, winning, and common sense put together. It's a less idealist version for sure. And it's a vision that suggests in some ways popular empowerment, but not ruled by the people directly in any way.
I think also I know something that you've explored as well, but the world of conspiracy theories is often undergirded or at least partially fueled by the idea of common sense. And just so I don't seem like I'm picking on one side at the expense of the other side or to the benefit of the other side, let's think about the shooting in Butler, Pennsylvania during the Trump campaign. I saw a lot of people who share my political sensibilities say, using common sense, sort of, it just doesn't seem possible that, they can take a shot at him and only his ear gets grazed and there's just enough blood for a good picture and he has presence of mind to stand up and put his fist in the air and there's this incredible, you had to almost plan it, photographic framing of the fist and the flag and the blood, and then he says, don't forget to bring my shoes. And people applying common sense say the fact that he would have that much composure at that moment, it just doesn't seem probable. It conflicts with common sense, which is the way a lot of conspiracy thinking goes, right?
Conspiracy thinking does actually require quite a bit of common sense. It gets crazy, sometimes towards the end in the details, but the point is to make everything fit together. A lot of our lives are kind of random, right? And we have to accept that some things that happen are commonsensical and some are not. In a conspiracy theory, all the pieces have to fit in a very strange way so that it's a puzzle. And you have to believe that you've seen something that the other people haven't. And particularly the people who've missed it are often people like journalists say, they tell us this, but we know what's really happening underneath. So common sense would sound opposed to conspiracy theory, but it can really be right at the root of it. And your example is a good one, right? The pieces, if you take all of those things to have been slightly random, you don't have much of a story. But if you suggest all these details, well, anybody would know that you put it all together, it's a hoax.
Exactly. All right, we have to stop there. This has been fascinating stuff. Sophia Rosenfeld, Walter H. Annenberg Professor of History and Chair of the History Department at the University of Pennsylvania, the author of multiple books, including Common Sense, A Political History. Her new book is The Age of Choice, A History of Freedom in Modern Life. We might be getting back to you on that one, too. But thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
And we're going to take a little break now. We're going to explore another set of questions about whether you could arrive at some kind of socially scientific understanding of what common sense really is.
A message from the king, a message from the king, a message from the
king. David Bowie came to town, flying overhead. Don't you dig my chops, he cried. This is what they said. Au contraire, Dave, quite the opposite.
As promised from the previous segment, we want to talk about whether it would be possible to quantify the idea of common sense, arrive at, in fact, a common understanding of what common sense is. Before we explore that with someone who's actually researched the question, let's listen to some voices that our intern, Angelica Gajewski, gathered out in the streets of Frog Hollow in Hartford B1, sir.
Could you describe what common sense means to you?
Common sense to me means understanding of things that are like universally believed. I think that's it. Just big picture ideas that everybody should know.
I think it means having a general background of knowledge and kind of understanding things get thrown out to you on a day-to-day basis.
And do you think you're someone with a lot of common sense?
I like to consider myself, yeah, probably everybody does, but I do think so, yes.
Yes and no, I think. I have the, street sense, or I think I have like a strong background in common sense, but there is also things that I'm a little unaware of. But I think compared to others, I do.
So let's transfer some of those thoughts over to Mark Whiting, a research fellow at the Computational Social Science Lab at the University of Pennsylvania. It's University of Pennsylvania day-to-day in the show, and a CTO of the startup Pareto AI. So, Mark, you hear a little bit of the Dunning-Kruger effect there at the end of those quotes, the idea. The Dunning-Kruger effect, referring to overconfidence. 75% of French men think they are better than average lovers. I'm guessing there's a little bit of that with common sense. It's not exactly the point of your research, but I'm thinking probably people think they have better than average common sense in numbers too big to make any common sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. We see a very interesting phenomenon around this, which is everybody thinks they have common sense. And if you ask them some things that they think are commonsensical, they often pinpoint behaviors that others take on as not being common sense. And of course, this can't hold true, right? They can't both be right. They can't both be doing things that are commonsensical if they both don't think that the other one is doing such things. And so we find this, and we really dig deep into this in our research, trying to understand how much shared awareness about the world and shared belief about the world there is, especially as groups get larger. And we see that it is diminishingly small. Between two people, maybe they share quite a lot. You add a third person, it diminishes substantially. You add 10 people, you add 100 people, you add 250 million people, and the number of shared items that people believe unilaterally and are aware that other people believe gets very, very close to zero.
Yeah, so and your methodology involves some pretty big numbers. I think it's more than 4,000 statements were evaluated by more than 2,000 subjects. Can you say a little bit more about that methodology, what it was you were trying to pin down?
Absolutely. So our realization was that people often think of others as not having common sense, but they do a very inconsistent job of really saying what that means. And scientists and many other areas of research have dug into this in a very kind of ad hoc way. And that was sort of disappointing for us. We thought there might be an interesting opportunity to do something a little bit more substantial. So we collected this set of statements, and these are statements that somebody had stated were common sense in some setting. And we had a variety of sources that we gathered, but we collected this set of statements. Then we collected a bunch of people to respond about these statements to two main questions per statement. And the main questions were, do you believe this is true? And do you think most other people believe it's true? And why this is an important pair of questions is that we can judge whether most people are accurate about what most other people believe, because we actually have both of those numbers. We can see what did most people believe about this, and then was your impression about what other people believed about it actually accurate? So we did this at scale. Everybody rated a bunch of these. We got over 100,000 ratings in our first experiment, which is the published paper that we've been just discussing. And we did this analysis to try to discover how much common sense there is in society.
And could you say a little bit more about, first of all, I should say that I went online and tried some of these questions out. And it gets complicated pretty quickly in your study. The first question I was asked was about electrical conductivity, which I don't really know anything about. But on the other hand, I was sort of looking at it and thinking, that seems right. The statement doesn't seem glaringly wrong. But then I had to sort of also ask myself, do most other people believe that? Whereas, when I get to think about hand washing preventing disease, that seemed pretty obviously received wisdom, common sense, something we could all kind of agree on. So I don't know, say a little bit more about all this and what the findings wound up being.
Well, I will. I'll just pinpoint one thing that's very important about what you just said, which is, there has to be heterogeneity in the set of statements,
yes.
Right? You could imagine a set of things that just about everyone would agree with, and I could probably create like close to an infinite number of those. Just imagine like 1 + 1 = 2, 2 + 2 = 4, right? Like I could generate all these things that are very agreed upon. And those aren't what we typically think of necessarily as common sense, but more as just sort of facts that everyone knows. And then on the other hand, I could easily generate things that are very rare common sense, right? Like something that maybe doctors agree on very widely, but nobody else in the community does. And what we really want is something kind of in between, something that people would say is common sense, but maybe there's some equivocation in society about whether that's true. And so that was part of our collection criteria here. Although, we collected pretty exhaustively and we have lots of all the kinds that you can imagine. All right. So I can also speak to the result for a moment if you like.
Sure.
The main result is that the kinds of things that are most commonsensical are sort of not surprising. They're plainly worded, fact-like statements that include features about everyday physical realities. Now, that sort of makes sense. It's like, if you drop a ball, it's going to break. If you, jump in the air, you're going to make a noise when you touch the ground, like all of these kinds of things. However, a lot of the things that we would often use as common sense, like, oh, that person stopped in the middle of the road because they're delivering something, don't they have the common sense to like park their car instead of stopping in the middle of the road? I'm not sure if this happens where you are. This happens constantly in Philadelphia. It is a core part of the Philadelphia experience. And I think a lot of people think this person definitely doesn't have common sense. And statements like that got much less agreement. So that is to say that they are considered less commonsensical or less clear examples of common sense, meaning there's more disagreement between groups in our population. So this is one view at those results.
Yeah,
go ahead.
It raises the question of whether common sense and consensus are the same thing or just different shades of the same thing. I'm thinking, we're talking after President Trump's speech to Congress, a person that he chose to be his guest was a woman who was injured in a volleyball game in which the ball was delivered at her by a trans person. And that's something that polls really well. The whole idea that women shouldn't have to compete in sports against athletes who were formerly men. And I mean, it polls like 80% or something, and polls pretty well among Democrats. So, and Trump, of course, likes to traffic in the idea of common sense. So I'm just wondering, is consensus and common sense, what's the relationship between those two ideas?
Yeah, so in our definition, we have two main factors, awareness and consensus. And so awareness is kind of whether you know a thing to be true, and whether other people are agree that it's true, and consensus is whether everyone agrees on it or not. So one is sort of like what you know about other people, and the other is whether other people actually carry the belief that you think they do. So both of these are really important, and one of the key bits about common sense that gets us in trouble is that there are many examples of situations where everyone does agree, but nobody realizes that they agree. And some issues like the ones that you're bringing up can be examples of that, where in fact there may be agreement across party lines, but it's very hard to establish that because maybe the discourse in modern politics really discourages agreement across party lines, and so you may not sort of understand how much other people believe a thing that you do because of that. And so that gives us an example of something that might be inconsistent common sense.
One of the things I love in your paper is you go back to an 18th century. We're back in the 18th century. We're talking about Thomas Paine in the previous segment. We're back in the 18th century. Scottish philosopher and poet James Beattie. He has a list of things that he regards as common sense. I exist. I am the same being today that I was yesterday or even 20 years ago. Things equal to one and the same thing are equal to one another. Ingratitude ought to be blamed and punished. The 3 angles of a triangle are equal to 2 right angles. A whole is greater than a part. Every effect has a cause. The senses can be believed. The ground on which I stand is hard, material, solid, and has real separate independent existence. The sun will rise tomorrow. I have a soul distinct from my body. Virtue and vice are different. So are heat and cold, red and white, and ox and an ass. Truth exists. There is a God. So that's quite a laundry list right there. And these things, all of these statements are not the same kinds of statements. Some of them are essentially affirmations of faith and belief. Others are empirically checkable. So let's talk about that grab bag there.
Yeah. So this is a key point that we focused on in the work, which is what makes the things that are common sense, treated as common sense or not, different. And so we provided a taxonomy that lets us structure the way people think about, knowledge as sort of epistemological structure. But that particular set is interesting because actually you're right. Some of these are factual. Some of them are just belief. And some of them are even a stretch. That's, unbelief to some extent. And that subtlety, we wanted to overlook the fact that things that people hold as true may not necessarily be true themselves. So we wanted to, embrace the idea that common sense isn't always the truth. And in fact, the truth may sometimes be counter to common sense for various weird reasons. And you can think of some cognitive biases as examples of this, where the actual truth is like different from what everyone feels and believes. But yeah, so we were very interested in the differences between statements. So we used the Wikipedia taxonomy as well as a bunch of properties of statements that we thought were really interesting and representative. And those include things like whether they're fact-like, or whether they're about belief, or whether they're aphorisms. Interestingly, aphorisms have this property that they sound commonsensical, and often people use them as though they're common sense. And one of the things that we were really excited by in our work was that we found that actually people are pretty attuned to the fact that aphorisms aren't necessarily common sense. And we were really worried that this would not happen. But when we tested it out, we found that people were aware that aphorisms are kind of like a fake form of common sense that sound good, but aren't really that reasonable. And just as an example that we love to give, you can have things like birds of a feather flock together, sounds totally reasonable. And then you can have something else like opposites attract, also sounds totally reasonable, but obviously they can't both be true. Now, you could say they're true in different situations, of course, but we don't treat them that way. We treat them as universal truths about the world.
I find myself wondering whether you would have been doing this study if you didn't live in the city of Ben Franklin. I mean, that's like the Poor Richard stuff is, very much what you're talking about.
Absolutely. And amusingly, my co-author on this paper, Duncan Watts, he lives just down the street from where Benjamin Franklin's printing press was, and where Thomas Paine used to live and work. So it's very funny that we're so co-located with many of these long-term beliefs. Not to mention Sophia Rosenfeld, whose work we also greatly admire.
So just to go back to Beatty, the Scottish philosopher. I don't know whether you know this or not, but Kant called Beatty's understanding of Hume positively painful.
I didn't know that. That's great.
But on the other hand, Beatty's one of his sort of legitimate claims to fame is, a fairly early anti-slavery voice within the community of philosophy. And that's also, this is all kind of baked into what you've been saying so far. But common sense sometimes is a thing that an idea ages into, something that's maybe radical at one point. Slavery is immoral. It shouldn't exist. It's a debasing institution. Maybe it needs a little time to acquire the cachet of common sense.
Yeah. One thing that we weren't able to study in this current paper was how common sense changes over time. And a lot of people reflect that they think modern society either has more or less common sense, and then it's absolutely obvious that that's the case, which again is counterintuitive. But a lot of people think that there was more common sense when they were kids. And we would love to dig into that. And so we've been trying to extend this work to sort of embrace that concept. But critically, things especially around moral philosophy end up being very critical, very different, and especially different in different locations. So in some places, something that is totally reasonable is is very unreasonable in a different one. And as I'm sure you can imagine, numerous cases of that exist in modern day politics. And we've been really interested to extend this work into a world scale analysis with many more participants and many more statements and so on. And so that's something that we're currently thinking about and working on, where I think we're going to see some much more interesting nuances between different moral values and different belief groups and so on and so forth.
I just want to say before we end that you can still take this study and participate in this study, and we will post a link to it on the webpage for this show. But just to sort of end in a place, probably if there's a quote from the study or a quote that you've given that jumps out at a lot of people, it's our findings suggest that each person's idea of common sense may be uniquely their own, making the concept less common than one might expect. You've already kind of said that earlier in this conversation, but maybe it's a good place to end. That the thing about common sense, if everybody has their own bespoke idea of common sense, how can it even be common?
Exactly. Yeah, that is the fundamental idea that I think we've shown. And more generally, the idea that this should be something that we measure. In fact, an interesting phenomenon here is that it was tricky to get this work published because to many scientists, it seems obvious what common sense is. However, our result shows that that's not true, and that there's surprising inconsistency in the interpretation and understanding of common sense. It isn't all that common.
We have to end there, but Mark Whiting, a research fellow at the Computational Social Science Lab at UPenn and CTO of the startup Pareto AI, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And we're going to take a little break. We're going to come back with one more segment about all this.
Everybody pulls his weight. Gee, our old LaSalle ran great. Those were the days.
We are back. Time to say some thank yous. One of them is to the person who just told me to start talking. That would be Dylan Reyes, the maestro. He is the technical producer of our show and the senior producer of the Colin McEnroe show. And, of course, the head of Lily Tyson Quality Entertainment Productions is Lily Tyson. She is the producer of this episode. And now we are going to talk a little bit about the concept or the difficulty, I guess, of melding the very non-specific idea of common sense with the burgeoning field of artificial intelligence, better known as AI these days. And we are going to talk to Mayank Kejriwal, a research professor and principal scientist at the University of Southern California, who is doing some pretty important work on this and wrote about it for the conversation. Mayank, welcome to our show right now.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So we start with a problem. It's a problem that has threaded through the rest of this show, which is that common sense itself is a rather difficult thing to define, let alone quantify. So talk about how AI research looks at that whole question.
Yes. So as you pointed out, it is very difficult to define, but we think about it in terms of three pillars. So one of them is social reasoning, right? So this is, how do you understand the mental model of someone you're talking to and navigate the social world, right? So that's really important in conversational AI, chatbots, that kind of thing. Then there's physical reasoning, right? So I know not to place a rock on a paper table because it's going to collapse. We call that naive physics, and that's important in robotics. And finally, we have common sense psychology, right? So I don't need to be a shrink to be empathetic, to see where you're coming from, and to answer questions or talk to you by assuming your mental model. So we need AI that is all three to be human-like, and so we are trying to build AI that excels on all three pillars, and that's how we think about it formally.
So let's take a specific example that's actually the beginning of your article. So imagine, I'll adapt it a little bit, but imagine you're having three people come over to your house for a meeting, and everybody's agreed that you're going to order pizza. But now you're not so sure whether maybe one or more of those people might be vegetarians. you really don't know. So there are a lot of ways that you could approach that. You could try to track everybody down and find out. You could order something other than pizza. There's a lot of things that you could do, but the sensible thing to do would be to order a margarita pizza just to be on the safe side. And you also know, because common sense tells you, the margarita pizza won't have anything weird like ham or pineapple or something like that people won't eat. There's just a whole bunch of unspoken things that are not really written down anywhere that amount to a common sense approach to that problem. And when you think about it that way, one does wonder how you impart something that's so heuristic and fuzzy and imprecise to an artificial intelligence.
Yeah, it's a great question, because unlike math, right, or something that is more formal, more skills based, there's no tutorial, there's no document, there's no manual, there's no YouTube video, right, that is going to teach anyone common sense. Children learn it by playing with toys, by observing the natural world. There's a natural bias. We are just not taught common sense. So what's happening now with the large language models like ChatGPT, right, that everyone has likely heard about, is that we want the AI to learn common sense almost as children learn common sense. So we want the AI to read, books and documents, to watch videos, to listen to stuff, and then to distill the principles of common sense on its own, just like children would, right? Where we don't have to write down the rules. So this is kind of the holy grail. We're getting closer to it. There is a lot of excitement because of the advances in ChatGPT, but we're still not quite there yet. It still makes mistakes that are distinctly non-common sense. And so there's still work to be done, but we're 90% of the way there, I would dare say.
So how would you test this? How would you test AI to see whether it has common sense?
Yeah, so for a long time, that we tested it in a very stupid way because it didn't have common sense, and that was the same way that we take an SAT test. So you have a question, you have 4 options. So if I say, Mary sat down on the bench, she's nervous. Why is she nervous, right? And then I give you 2 options. Well, she's going to play with a doll. She's going to play the piano for an audience, right? And so it's kind of obvious. It's like a gotcha question, and it should pick the number 2 option, not number 1, right? So it's multiple choice, but that's kind of trivial. It's not that compelling. But previous AIs would completely flunk such testing. Now the AI does a lot better on multiple choice questions. So we are moving beyond to problems that are more long term. Right. So I am advocating for AI to have internships, right, where the AI has to do something for a month, for 2 months. It works with us almost like a human being, and we can observe it in the wild. We can kind of see, how well does it do on a 1-month time horizon, 2-month time horizon, and as real world irregularities come up, right, like unusual situations come up, how does it respond to it? How robust is it, right? And so now it's more long-term. It's more like an internship for AI, but it used to be very simple and trivial because it's such a hard problem.
I think that's a really interesting idea. I mean, we have interns here, and every day we ask them to do things that they couldn't have anticipated being asked to do. So I guess that's the virtue of this, right? If you throw AI into a situation that it couldn't really anticipate, because that's a lot of what common sense is.
Yes, exactly. It's the stuff that we take for granted, right? So the interesting thing is the AI is very good at formal skills. It can pass the bar exam. It has all this medical knowledge. It's read all of Wikipedia. It can write a poem. It can write a recommendation letter. I just did that for one of my students yesterday. So it can do all of these things, but surprisingly enough, it doesn't have, or we are not sure that it can handle commonsensical situations. So I think the best and only real way to evaluate it is to throw it into the real world where none of us know, what's going to happen really. But we can trust ourselves in most situations to come up with decent solutions.
Exactly. Okay. Unfortunately, we have to stop there, but we will follow this up with you, particularly because we need interns. So, Mayank Kejriwal is research professor and principal science at the University of Southern California. Thanks for your time. Thanks to the rest of you, too. Enjoy your day and exercise common sense, assuming we know what that is.